Right now, you're in a room. You're up on an isolated hill, and it's dark in here. On the table are 2 or 3 kerosene lamps that are flickering and pushing back the darkness, but otherwise, it's dark. I want you to lend me your imagination and come with me. In this setting, it's cold. Instead of having shed your coats, you're wrapped up in your coats. You have on your gloves and your hats, and your toes are tingling with the sting of cold that is nipping at them. You're with me up on the hill where I lived until I was almost 16 years old, because my parents believed that the world was coming to an end, and they took us away from society and into isolation, into a lifestyle that was like the 19th century instead of modern day. Please show the first picture. This is a picture of me at 16 years old. At this point, I had never gone to school. I had not had a single friend my age. I had been studying, when I did study, the books that we had at home by way of kerosene lamp. I had a longing to learn, and I wanted to find my way, but at this point, I couldn't visualize ever anything else other than what I had known. I've captured my story in my book. It's called Born Yesterday, the story of a girl born in the 20th century but raised in the 19th. I published it in 2014 simply because I felt compelled to tell my story. And in fulfilling that compulsion, I simply put it out there and left it. It did get picked up by Pacific Press and republished in 2016 by them, but my purpose was simply to do what the Lord had asked me to do. And today I'm telling my story because of, or from the angle of education. Because education shaped my life, and education is the context that brings each one of us here today mutually. And so I want to tell you about my story of developing as a result of being deprived formal education, and how I got from where I was to where I am now, and why education matters so much to me, for myself and for you, and why I hope you can appreciate your education. My life started out normal. You can put the picture away. I'll tell you when to bring out the next one. My life started out normal. Until about the age of 6, lived in a neighborhood, had 2 brothers. They were very annoying. Used to ride my bike, learned to ride bikes, cut my forehead trying to ride a bike, doing the normal things that little kids do. But then, one day, it was 1972, I was 6 years old. I was sitting in my room playing on the floor, and my mom came in and she sat down beside me on the floor after opening the closet doors, and she said to me, "Look in the closet. Look at your dresses. Your dresses are all short. Did you know that Jesus wants you to wear a dress down to the foot? Do you want to be like Jesus? Do you want to wear your dress down to the foot?" Well, I was a little child, and of course I said yes. And this is a picture of me, and that one of my first homemade long dresses that my mom began to make for us. That was one of a number of changes that were already happening in my life, but this is the first one I noticed really well. We had already had some dietary changes, and then this. The next thing that happened, though, absolutely changed the course of my life. Because my father went down to, my brothers were in a Christian elementary school. And my father went down to the elementary school to pick up his sons from school. And he saw my second brother. He was dancing to the music that this principal's son was playing on the piano. And my father said, "My son is not going to be dancing to boogie-woogie music, bouncy music. He's not going to do that. I do not want him exposed to these worldly influences." And so he made the decision that he was going to take my brothers out of school and that I would not be allowed to start school. And I would have no way of knowing that I would never step foot in a classroom of any kind until I was nearly 17 years old. Because when my parents made this decision, the authorities came after us. And so that set us on a course of going off the grid, dodging the authorities, trying to live in a way that allowed us to not be separated from our parents, and yet for them to carry out their beliefs. As I mentioned, they thought the world was coming to an end, and so there was a very great compulsion to separate from all those things that may seem to be corrupting and to keep ourselves pure and to prepare ourselves for the second coming of Jesus. We took very literally everything that we read. It was a very simplistic, literal, black and white thinking. Now, our faith context was Seventh-day Adventists, but where some of you have 28 doctrines that govern your faith, and I know there's some argument about whether 28 is too many, I think we had added at least another 28 to the 28. So not only did we wear long dresses, we were wearing bonnets by the time we moved onto the hill. I was 9 years old when we moved on what we call the hill. And I wore a bonnet and long dress every day. This was not a costume. It's not something that I could take off when I felt like it. This was daily. When I walked out of my room, I was clad in a bonnet because of scriptures and quotes from books that we believed governed our lives as the pure people of God. We were offshoots, in short. And with that came the whole need to separate educationally. As I already said, we weren't going to be going to school. My parents, though, did want us to have some form of education. So they went out of their way to order some things. This is a picture of me. I don't think they can see the picture. That's a picture, I hope they can show you, of life on the hill. It's a very isolated setting, and you can see 50 acres set up on a hill away from everyone and hard to get to. So anyway, we lived like this on a daily basis, separated from society, and we had informal schooling at home. Our curriculum was guided by studying Mennonite textbooks and Bible and survival. The survival part, if you can imagine having no electricity, no running water, no plumbing, having to haul your water from a stream, having to store what's left over after you fix food in a container and put it in a refrigerator overnight, and not refrigerator, in the stream because you don't have a refrigerator. If you can picture every process being manual, you need to wash clothes. My mom, when we needed to wash clothes, she would get a barrel, 2 barrels, and put water in it, and it would have sometimes ice floating in the water. And we would use a scrub board to scrub the clothes, denim jeans and corduroy dresses, on a scrub board and then hang them out, often to freeze if it was cold enough, until finally the sun had warmed up enough to dry them. And so this is how daily life was, and that was the survival. Our curriculum was guided by Bible and survival, and so there wasn't a lot of time for the formal learning, although my mother made her best attempt to still teach us. And so often it was open a book and you read as much as you could, you learn as much as you could, and there was something that I couldn't learn. It was math. I couldn't seem to understand math. Science was largely unknown to me. There was a lot of things that I could not understand because the isolation of studying alone made it very difficult for me to learn. We did a lot of training in this environment because, as I mentioned, we had so many beliefs, and my parents wanted us to be able to defend everything that we believed, scripture and verse, quoted accurately, so that we could defend the hope that was within us. And so there was a lot of training sessions. My father would dress up sometimes like a judge. He would put on a robe, and he would come out and sit at a table that was covered with an impressive black cloth, kind of parenting a courtroom situation. And he would sit there and he would go through our many different beliefs, and we had to be able to quote accurately what the passage said and explain it flawlessly. And if we did it without making any errors, the reward was painless decapitation. However, if you messed up, then the punishment was to be burned alive at the stake. I'm really happy to tell you that although I was a martyr for my faith, I passed all my tests. That was the nature of the training that we had from day to day. But there was something else going on. And it's kind of interesting because often you'll be caught in a situation, an environment, and you can't see how anything could ever change, and what you know is all you know, and yet often there are forces at work. There are things that are happening that are preparing for change, and you don't even know it, and often those things are happening inside of you. In my case, because we were so inundated with doctrinal material and things that we were supposed to read, I eventually began to pick up the Bible and books by Ellen White and began reading them just to know what was there, just to see for myself. I actually remember what got me started. I wanted to know if my parents were actually raising me right, so I made a decision to read Child Guidance. And in that book, I discovered things like being compassionate and not necessarily forcing your children to make decisions in ways that were, when they're old enough to make decisions for themselves, not to be harsh. And one of the things is my father had a very bad temper because of things that had happened in his life. He actually suffered from PTSD. And so he had an explosive temper. And I found in those books that rage and anger and contention should not be a part of the Christian home. And I thought, wow, that's good to know. What else is wrong that should be right? And so I kept reading, and I began to discover more and more things that were different from the way I was being taught. Mostly things like a much more loving, compassionate Savior, the idea of something that wasn't so nuanced. Not everything about what we were supposed to think and do was in black and white, in a simplistic form like we have been taught. And so it made me wonder if we were maybe a little bit off. And one day I read this quote, and it was from a book, Fundamentals of Christian Education. It said, "Dear youth, what is the aim and purpose of your life? What are your ambitions for education, that you may have a name and a position in the world? Have you thoughts that you dare not express, that you may one day stand upon the summit of intellectual greatness, that you may sit in deliberative and legislative councils and help enact laws for the nation?" There is nothing wrong with these aspirations. You may every one of you make your mark. You should be content with no mean standard, no low standard. Aim high and spare no pains to reach the standard. I was shocked. I can't fathom doing some of the things that are being described with no education, being separated from society and the world and keeping myself untouched from people around me. How can I do these things? Stand in legislative halls and enact laws for the nation? How are those things possible if I am stuck in this isolated environment? And that brought to life a latent desire that had been there. And it was the desire to have a future and a life, and desire to know what truly was right for me. The desire to truly know what was God's will for my life, unpinned from the confines of a religion that I now know is extreme, but at the time I did not know. And so guess what I began to do? I began to pray. They weren't prayers of, "Oh God, let me go to school," because I thought that thinking was wrong, but they were wordless prayers. I would kneel in my window at night and just lift my heart up, knowing that somehow God knows the longing that's going on here. And maybe something would happen. And as I continued to pray, and I should mention, I started praying when I was 14 years old. For 2 years, it seems as though nothing was happening. Nothing changed. But you know, when you plant a seed, you can't always see what's happening with that seed, but just because you can't see doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Often below the surface, there is life that's occurring. You just can't tell what's going on. One day, I'm 16 years old. My father calls me aside and he hands me an envelope. And he said to me, "Rachel, I want you to keep this envelope because this is all you'll ever have of me going forward." What? It was a lock of his hair. He told me, "I'm not coming back. I'm leaving. And keep this because this is all you're going to have." I wandered outside after he walked away, trying to figure out what was going on. I knew my father and my older brother were getting ready to go to Houston, Texas. I knew that they were supposed to be gone for a few months building houses, but the plan was that they go and that they come back because we were very poor, and so we struggled financially. And so this was going to give us a financial boost. And so that was the plan, but what is he talking about? This is all. When my mother went over to the car to give him a goodbye kiss, he turned his head. And then as the car drove away, he leaned out and he said words that I didn't understand to her, but I got the gist. He wasn't coming back. Often, what seems like a devastating thing can actually be the moment when everything begins to change and an opportunity opens up in your life that had never been there before. When my father left, and soon after my second brother followed, we realized, my mom and I, that there was no way we could maintain this manual life on this hill. There was no way that we could keep going. And so my mother wrote a lady who lived in the state of Washington, we had mostly been corresponding with, and she asked this lady who had planned to come visit that summer if she would send 2 one-way tickets so that we could come to her because we could no longer stay where we were. And the lady did. From there, when I left this home, please show the next picture. When I left the hill, that my father leaving was the door for me to go. And when I left the hill, I left knowing that I was going to go to school. I had been praying and praying to go to school, and I knew it was going to happen. And the second day on the bus, when I woke up, we left on a Greyhound bus, and I fell asleep that night with tears streaming down my face because I was moving into a world that was completely unknown. I realized that I didn't know anything that was in front of me going forward, and that everything would be new and strange. And so I fell asleep because the fear, you feel afraid when you're facing something new, and that's only natural. But yet I wanted to keep going. I wanted to find a way to go to school. And in the morning, when I woke up, the sun was right on the hill. It was shining right there into my eyes. And I had fallen asleep with my Bible on my lap, and I looked down, and guess what I saw? It was Isaiah 30, verses 20 and 21. They just leaped off the page. Though the Lord give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, yet shall not your teachers be removed into a corner anymore, but your eyes shall see your teachers, and your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk ye in it, when you turn to the right hand and when you turn to the left. And so I went with courage, knowing that God was going to be with me. At Fountain View, changes came. I was able to finally take off my bonnet, not because I wanted to just abandon everything that I believed to be right, but because I finally learned about something called principles. I learned of great underlying truths that don't change, and I learned that modesty didn't have to be expressed by wearing bonnets and long dresses. I began to realize I could make other changes as well, but the one thing that I couldn't do easily was learn academically when it came to math and science. I had my challenges there. When I first got there, they gave me a battery of tests because I had no records. There was nothing to go by to determine how to place me. By the way, I should have mentioned the school where I ended up going. I went to Washington State, and while we were in the car from the bus station, heading to the lady's home who had picked us up, I asked her, do you know somewhere where I could go to school? And that's when I found out about Fountain View. And I ended up being at Fountain View for 3 years. I was the only person of color there at Fountain View the entire 3 years, but I wanted to learn, and I knew that whatever I have to go through is part of what I have to go through, even if it means trying to figure out how to be myself when I had never been around one person, never mind 30, and 30 people who had come from totally different backgrounds and experiences than me. But math was a challenge. I couldn't seem to master it. 2 years into being there, I was still at an F average in math, and I needed to be able to get to a C in order to graduate. They appointed me a tutor, and it still didn't work. For 6 months, my tutor worked with me at least 3 times a week, trying to help me to understand things like algebra, things like geometry, and other forms of math, and I couldn't seem to master it. And then a teacher took compassion on me, even though I wasn't supposed to. I did go from I did go from an F average to a D average, but I couldn't get up to the C that was required to go into algebra. But the teacher took a chance on me. She said, as hard as you're trying, I think you'll make it. Let me just let you go ahead and get into my class. And algebra was so strange that I couldn't make sense of it. And so I didn't have to I no longer had to use logic. And that's when some of the skills that I had developed on the Hill, such as memorization and recognizing patterns and just being, especially the memorization, but rules, being inundated with so many rules in my life, came back to help. And now I'm able to use those same skills that I had honed so well to help me to learn that algebra. And I got to where, when I graduated from Fountain View, not only was I able to pass and graduate and move on with a C average, but when I finally did go to college a couple of years later, I was able to take the ACT and score at a well enough so that I did not have to do any remedial classwork. Later on, I was able to take the GRE and get into grad school twice and did not have to worry about anything remedial because of what I've learned. There are people in life who sometimes take a chance on you, and that is a tremendous blessing when it happens. And so I moved forward, went on to college, and began to find myself professionally, and I discovered that I could do anything that I wanted to do in life. And eventually, I kept hearing, you're going to be able to do anything you want. And I won a $20,000 fellowship to Ohio State University. Amazing, which back then was actually amazing because that was like a full ride. But what often happens in life is that when you begin to experience a sense of success, or you begin to realize where your strengths are, fear kicks in. And I don't know about any of you, but for some of us, for some people, success is more scary than failure. And that's what happened with me. So the day I graduated and I walked down that long aisle to receive my degree, that was in the morning. In the afternoon, please show the next one, I walked down another aisle and I got married. The reason why I did this is because I wanted to be safe. I didn't want to move too far away from the things that I had been taught, and the man that I married reminded me of my background without being quite as extreme. I wanted to make sure that I didn't let educational pursuits take me too far away, and he didn't believe in higher degrees, and so that felt very comfortable to me. And so I ended up getting married, and of course you can guess that was not the right choice. 3 years later, 4 years later, I'm a single mom with 2 children, raising kids, and trying to figure out what my path of life going forward is. And once again, it was education. I was able to apply for a master's degree, get accepted with a full fellowship, and was able to do a 2-year master's degree in English in 1 year. From there, and I know I'm talking about degrees, but it's not about degrees. I'm talking about a path forward that is laid out for you where you can grow and develop. And I kept resisting that path, not because I didn't want to learn, but because I was afraid that it was the wrong path for me. And some of you are going through that. You know that there's a certain path where every time you walk down it, you can tell that it's working for you. You can tell, maybe it's your major. Maybe you're in the wrong major. Maybe you're doing something because you felt like you have to do it. It's the path that you were told you need to walk. But there's something that keeps trying to tell you, there's another path I have for you. This is the way, walk you in it. Do you listen or do you resist? And so it took a while after I finished my master's, even though I was succeeding professionally, to find my way forward and to figure out what it was I needed to do in life. And finally, after wasting about 7 years of wandering in circles, I got back down on my knees again, prayed, and then the Lord began to talk to me and led me to get my doctorate. It was like he was telling me that there are things I want to do with your life, which I can do if you do this, which may not be possible if you don't. To whom much is given, much is required, and I want you to develop your life for wider service, so go for your PhD. And so I got a PhD in communication from Regent University, and indeed, it did open the door to many things. What I didn't realize, the very first thing it opened the door to was understanding my own life. My very first class that I took was qualitative research. I had never heard of this form of research. And I discovered a type of research called ethnography, studying people in their own cultural settings. And then I found out about autoethnography, the study of self set in culture. And that's when I began to realize, as my professors learned about my background and my classmates began to learn about what I had come from, they began to tell me, you can use this for research material. You can use this for exploring the lives of others who have also come from different kinds of backgrounds, and help them to understand the transition process, help them to understand adjustment, help them to understand what it's like to be isolated and to make that adjustment. And so I ended up using it to write my dissertation, and then ultimately I was able to write my book. And what I couldn't have known then, when the Lord was talking to me and telling me He wanted me to get my doctorate, is that it would lead me ultimately here to Southern. I couldn't have been in the role that I am now as dean if I had not pursued that. And so God brought me here to Southern. Now the thing is, you notice I said I ended up going to academy, pursuing education, then I go to college, pursuing more education, then I went for a master's, and then I went for a doctorate. And by the way, right after I got here, I completed a second doctorate. So my husband just keeps telling me that I'm going to go for a third one. But what I'm trying to tell him, and what I want you to know, is that what is happening now in my life and has been happening over the past 10 years, although I still have this longing to learn, it's being transformed into a passion for you, a passion for young people today to understand the value of the education that they have in front of them. And I'm speaking of both formal and informal. What I'm talking about is discovering the path that's right for you and walking in it even if you are afraid. Nothing ever happens without obstacles. Nothing ever happens without something trying to hold you back. And right now, you might have something who's trying to tell you that you must give up. When you go home for Thanksgiving, no point in coming back. You may have something that tells you that you failed. In my life, what happened was that I had nothing to look back on to say I could be successful. You may have that too. You don't see any success. You only see trying, and no succeeding. But let me tell you, when you hold an acorn in your hand, there is no way that you could tell by looking at that acorn the oak tree that it could become. And it's the same way with your life. You're looking at yourself right now, and there's no way that you can tell the plan that is there for you and the potential, the design, the beauty that your life has within it and could be realized if you just don't give up. I'm talking about choosing faith over fear. I'm talking about not letting your past dictate your future. I'm talking about taking the next step that's in front of you and continuing to move forward and refusing to accept defeat no matter what. No matter what the demons inside of you are telling you, no matter what people around you may be saying to you. When I was at Academy, and I'm finishing now, but when I went to Academy and I was testing that first day where they gave me that battery of tests, the principal came out and told me in front of a couple other people, she wasn't trying to be disrespectful, but it's just how it happened, that the only reason why I scored a first grade level in math was because that was the lowest the test would score. And I had also taken an IQ test, and she told me the only reason why that I scored at a level just below retarded. And it's okay. What it means is that it'll take you longer to learn than most, but you really can learn. But you can imagine how I felt. The reason why I scored those things is because there was all these gaps to fill in. It's not because I was dumb or stupid or couldn't learn, but I had to find my path forward to learning. And it wasn't like anyone else's. And your path forward is different from everyone else's. I don't care that there's 3,000 people at Southern. There's you, and you, and there's you. And each of you have a reason for being here. So when I see you, and those of you at the SJC know, I always ask you, how you doing? I'm not asking just because it's the obligatory, how are you? I really want to know. I don't want you to be trapped in some kind of reality, not realizing that somebody cares about you, that you're not alone. You don't have to be alone. You may not have been isolated on a hill, but you could be isolated in some type of addiction, in abuse, in a background that has given you no reason to believe in who you are and what you can do. Maybe no reason to believe and trust that there's a God that loves or cares about you. But I know that that's not true. I stand before you as a living testimony of what can happen. And I'm not famous. I haven't done all grand things in life that potentially someone else could have done. But I have lived deeply and fully, and I'm here now to care about you, and I'm able to make a difference, I hope, in your life. So, if you don't get anything else from my story, I hope that you take away a couple of things. And one is that what you have right now in front of you in the way of educational opportunity is rich, deep, and wonderful. What you get out of it depends on what you're willing to put in it, but the potential lies within you. The other thing I want you to know is that no matter what your past has told you, no matter what life has made you want to believe, you can succeed. There is a purpose for your life. There's a reason why you're here. And God has amazing things for you. Thank you so much for listening.